out how much acid rain comes down, but individual farmers might know more about how much acid rain affects their ability to farm, their ability to adapt and deal with the problem. And that's not going to be incorporated into any scientific analysis unless we go out and survey and ask people, right? So all these share the fact that science and expertise, while useful, are not going to be enough. And this is true for a broad class of cases. So whenever there's subjective existence values for environment or for cultures, some expert could assign the value for those, but some people think it would be better to figure out how much individuals put value in those things. Another example is personal or privately valued property or consumption. Like, you know, if you live in a house and the government comes to take the house from you, from eminent domain, and they just pay you the market value, you wouldn't think that's really fair compensation because you've grown up there, it has an extra value to you. And the question is, how do you figure out what that is? That's the same problem we have with the value of human life and health, right? We knew how much the marginal person was willing to pay, but those inframarginal people, we didn't know how much they valued it, right? Local information about technology or the impacts of global events are another area where individual people's information is important. So for example, entrepreneurs who are thinking of the next generation of technologies might know how cheap it's going to be to mitigate carbon or not, but that information is not going to be incorporated into the social decisions we make about carbon reduction, right? Or a New Yorker might know how subject his particular house is to flooding risk, how much work he's put into protecting it against flooding risk, and therefore how valuable it is, or not valuable it is, for to avoid climate change that would flood New York City, right? The question is, how do we, as a practical matter, infer these things, get them out of people? Okay, now, when it is really genuinely important to get these information about people, and they really have important things that we don't know, and it's not just that they have opinions or guesses or whatever, which a scientist would do a better job at calculating, then we're going to have to go out and ask people in some fashion. But the important thing to remember is that, as we're going to see, it's going to be very, very hard to get this information from people. Very complicated problem. And it's not that we should have some sort of ideological view that what defines the value of something is just what people out there think it is. It's rather that we think there's some concrete piece of information that that person has that society doesn't have. So for example, you know, if I were to go to people all over the world and survey them and say, how valuable is it to reduce carbon by this amount? Most people probably wouldn't even know what I was asking them, right? If I ask them something more concrete, something that's more specific to their lives, they might actually have a better sense of that than a scientist would, unlike the first question, right? So it's important, first of all, to focus these things on the areas where we think there actually is information that we want to get from people that we don't have. Okay, so one example of this is the inherent value of cultures. So, like, how much is it worth it to preserve some tribe that in Africa that might die off if we don't give them subsidies of some sort, right? And do these values come from, you know, what some anthropologist thinks that that tribe's existence is worth? Because they're obviously an expert. They know more about the history of that tribe, their richness, and so forth. Or do they in some way need to be derived from what you and I are willing to pay for that tribe to continue existing? If we think the latter, or we think that there's information that people have about how valuable this stuff is, then we might want to go around and ask people. Jing, what do we call the approach of going around and asking people how much they value certain what? Survey, but it's a particular type of survey.
Contingent valuation.
Exactly. Contingent valuation survey. Exactly. So this simple traditional approach has a long history, contingent valuation surveys. What you do is you describe different situations. You ask individuals how much they pay to be in one situation over the other, and then you assume that this is their true willingness to pay. This is most commonly used for environmental issues, or for other things like creating transport or public goods, etc. Okay, so Matt Klein, do you want to give some examples of classic applications of contingent valuation surveys?
Sure. So if you have a forest, for example, that population values, you can ask them what they paid to not have it cut down.
Yeah, that's a good example.
Or if there's a pretty view, you can ask them what they paid to avoid having it smogged up.
Exactly. Yeah, one classic example that they actually did was the value of preserving visibility of the Grand Canyon, the value of preserving seals or whales in the ocean, value of not logging in national forests, value of the birds killed by the Exxon Valdez spill, value of preserving languages of indigenous cultures, building a new beautiful building in a city that people would admire. These are regularly commissioned by regulatory agencies, courts, etc., and they all involve some benefit cost analysis for, externalities, regulations, actions, or to assess the value of the cost of an oil spill. And these are the most formal version of these, what are usually called contingent valuation surveys, are formal surveys where we go around saying, how many dollars would you be willing to pay for X over Y? But there's also sort of informal things like this, which are even more influential on policy. So anytime a politician goes around and commissions a survey to say, how many people are in favor of X or Y, in some sense they're doing a very reduced form version of a contingent valuation survey. They're saying, how much do you like this over that? Not how much, but just whether you like this over that. I think a lot of the problems that show up with contingent valuation surveys, though they're much more extreme with contingent valuation surveys for reasons we'll do, are the problems that show up with doing those types of polls. Okay, so these types of surveys are not very well respected among economists. And Justin, why don't economists like these types of methods?
Because a lot of people might answer stuff wrong, or especially if it's in a survey like comes in a magazine or something, people might not care about it. They just might get false answers.
Yeah.
Or I guess some people might not tell the truth because they feel morally obligated, conform with the social norm.
Yeah, those are all good reasons. So one basic thing that Justin said is people don't take these things seriously. Imagine someone came up to you and said, we're running a survey on how much the birds from the Exxon Valdez are worth to you. Would you take that seriously? You would probably, if they were paying you something to take the survey, just say, okay, I'll take your $10 and I'll answer the survey using random numbers and I'll get done with it, right? Another thing is that people often answer the wrong question. So they sometimes will give an overall valuation of how much society should be willing to pay, rather than how much they individually would be willing to pay, right? Another thing is that people often don't have any idea, information, or experience with the relevant thing. So imagine someone comes to you and says, how much is it worth it to you to preserve visibility of the Grand Canyon? You've never been to the Grand Canyon. Maybe you've never even heard of the Grand Canyon. What are you supposed to say to that question, right? Another thing is that people might, as Justin was saying, give you an answer just to make you feel good about me, or to make me feel good about me, because I'm willing to pay a lot to preserve the birds in the bay, not something that I would actually be willing to pay, right? And in fact, this manifests itself in the fact that people's responses are usually highly inconsistent or apparently irrational. So if you reorder the questions in some way, you usually get an order of magnitude difference in terms of what people report. And also, people just have no incentives to get things right and have no experience with this sort of thing. So it's like you're asking them to do something out of the blue that they've never had to do before in their lives. What sort of thing do you expect to get from them, right? Okay. Now, if we actually think about the incentives, things can actually be much worse. And what the incentives are depend on what the survey is used for. So one scenario is that just nobody takes the survey seriously at all. They just think that this is some random thing that a student is doing, to write his BA or whatever, and they don't think it's going to affect anything in the world. Then what are their incentives in terms of responding? David, Wayne.
There really isn't any incentive
Yeah.
to do so, other than maybe just
Being nice to the person,
Yeah, exactly.
or getting rid of them, right? Your incentive is to get them out of your house, right? So, so in that case, you know, you're not going to do anything, and we have all the problems we talked about before. But on the other hand, Lewis, what if people actually think this survey is going to be taken really seriously and affect public policy?
Well, if it has a major effect on him, on that particular person, then they have an incentive to answer truthfully. Or
Do they? Do they?
well, if they can benefit by lying, then
Well, think about it. Think about it. In these situations, imagine we're doing a survey, and that's going to determine whether we chop down the forest or not. Would you report how much you'd be willing to pay for that forest not to be chopped down? What would you report?
well, if I want it to be chopped down, then
You report 0.
right.
And if you don't want it to be chopped down, you would report like hundreds of billions of dollars, right? Because then you would totally screw up the whole survey and get whatever outcome you want, right? In other words, you never have the incentive to report the right thing in this type of a survey, right? So a great example of this was like the Economist. There's a nice article from there that I think might be on your syllabus. They went around Haiti and they asked people, are you getting aid from the American government? And everybody said, no, we're not getting any aid from the American government. And then the Economist like went and looked, and everyone was eating all these meals ready to eat from American soldiers. And they said, why did you lie to us and tell us you weren't getting any aid? You're obviously eating stuff from American soldiers. And said, oh, well, you know, if we tell you that we're getting aid, then they're going to stop sending the aid, right? So, like, if this actually thinks that, if people actually think it has an effect on policy, then people aren't going to tell the truth at all, right? Okay, so if we want to take seriously the results from this sort of a survey, we need to consider the relevant incentives. So suppose, just to be concrete, that we know what are going to be the benefits of doing some activity. And now we want to determine what the socially optimal amount is, right? And imagine each individual knows how much the activity harms them. And the total social harm is the sum of the harm to all the individuals. Question is, how can we get people to tell the truth about the harms to them? David Mount, do you remember reading about the way we could try to get people to tell the truth about how harmed they were? What could we do?
It's hard.
It is hard. In fact, a guy won the Nobel Prize for figuring
We
out this.
can get people's friends to ask them.
Wow, that's an interesting idea.
They're more likely to tell the truth to someone who they're from, like.
Yeah, but what if their friends lie to you in reporting what they said? Anybody else? Charlie.
The Great Clark's Groves mechanism.
And how does that work,
It
Charlie?
basically internalizes the externality by you like give them a side payment or something that's based on the total average of everybody's values. So you're incentivized to report your true value.
Yeah, so let's try to make that a little bit more precise, but Charlie's definitely going in the right direction. So one approach is just to push this thing back another layer, which is saying, well, we know that if we internalize all externalities, then people will do what's socially optimal, right? And so if the socially optimal thing is for them to tell the truth, if we internalize the externalities that arise from them saying one thing versus the other, then the people are going to want to tell the truth. So the question is, what are the externalities of me saying something, right? Well, Justin, what do you think the externalities are if I say that I'm really harmed by some activity like pollution? What externalities does that create for everyone else? If we as a society are determining how much pollution there is based on what you said.
If you say you're really harmed by pollution, then I guess that implies that there